Hi, my name is Laura Powell, and I serve on the Woodstock Select Board. Today I'm here to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is housing. I know everyone in Vermont is talking about housing right now, and I'd like to talk about some of the reasons that we're in a housing crisis and also what we're doing in Woodstock to help alleviate that. So anybody who's had a conversation with me over the past 2 years knows that housing is like the first and last thing that I like to bring up. It's what I consider to be the root cause of many of the issues that we are suffering here in Vermont. If you remember the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, there's the father character in there likes to say, give me a word, any word, and I'll tell you the Greek root of it. I'm the same way. If there's a problem or a symptom in Woodstock, I like to say, let me tell you how it's attached to housing. For example, recently this happens, especially when we're plowing the roads. Folks like to know why the roads aren't getting plowed fast enough, or why trash bins in town sometimes get overfull. Right now we are down 2 staff members in our highway department. And because of that, we are not able to keep the maintenance schedule that I think our community expects and deserves. And one of the main reasons that we are unable to hire right now is the lack of available housing for town employees. So for those who know, Vermont especially has been experiencing, the nation in general, but Vermont especially has been experiencing a housing crisis. There's a recent statewide housing needs assessment that said Vermont will require between 24 and 36,000 housing units in the next 4 years to meet demand. That's a huge number. We know from a housing study we did pre-pandemic that the EDC conducted at that time, we needed about 500 affordable units in Woodstock alone to meet demand. I would say that number has increased by a lot over the past 5 years. And it's things like obviously being overhoused, which because we lack smaller, denser housing, our older Vermonters are aging in place in larger homes. And so because they're unable to find housing inventory that allows them to maybe age in place with access to all the services they need, smaller home, maybe an apartment even, they're staying in those homes and those homes aren't turning over in the market. And so people who want to move here, who maybe have large families or standard size families, are unable to enter the housing market or have to make certain compromises to make housing work for them. Another thing, demographic-wise, that we're struggling with is just the fact that Vermont is, by all intents and purposes, an old state. And a lot of that has to do with the lack of available housing. But we're seeing that play out in a lot of different ways. As we're all watching, the legislature is trying to sort out education funding this session. One of the biggest cost centers of our education system is healthcare. And because we do not have enough young people to subsidize the costs of health insurance for older people who have more conditions, who are seeing more providers, those costs are going to keep increasing and increasing and increasing. A few other reasons, we're just really behind on development. Vermont notoriously is, I won't say anti-development, but has a very complicated view of development. This has been a great thing in terms of preserving the aesthetic of Vermont that we all know and love and why a lot of us came here. But it's also been really difficult to meet the needs of our communities. Infrastructure is another reason that housing is not getting built, where our state is rural and a lot of towns and communities don't have access to public water and sewer that would make things cost effective for developers. So one of the things that Woodstock is doing, obviously, for those of you who know, we're finalizing the purchase of the Woodstock Aqueduct Company. Many people know from that campaign last year that the Aqueduct Company couldn't support any new connections. So any new housing that happened in the village over the past couple of years has had to drill private wells. This is not sustainable for many reasons, but mostly for cost. Adding the cost of drilling wells for developers is really, I think, disincentivizes developers to come here. And we've known for a long time that the current ownership of the Aqueduct Company has no desire or interest in running a company above what the state regulatory bodies consider the bare minimum of compliance. They're not interested in growing the connections the way that the town is. We also have a lot of housing incentives. So many people don't know, but Woodstock has a housing advisor who serves as a hub for housing needs. They are a matchmaker of sorts. So they work with property owners, they work with people who want to move to the area, they work with people whose housing might have fallen through. And they also work with employers to figure out and kind of match up needs. We have several incentive programs running currently for leasing housing to local workers, for building accessory dwelling units, which are smaller structures that are accessory to the main property. You've probably seen some of those around town. Converting short-term to long-term leases and home sharing. We're also really lucky to have a nonprofit, Woodstock Community Trust, in our midst. Their program, Local Deeds, provides grants for down payments to local workers in exchange for deed restrictions. I personally can't say enough good things about this program. It's obviously very expensive to administer when you think of the cost of a down payment right now. But I think it's incredibly worthwhile to give people a pathway to home ownership that otherwise wouldn't be available. One of the other things we're doing right now and have been doing for the past few years is updating and revising our zoning bylaws. So those who have kept tabs on the Planning Commission know that about 2 years ago, the village updated their zoning bylaws to incorporate a lot of what we call smart growth principles, and also to be compliant with state statute that was coming out of the legislature. So those are things like reducing residential parking minimums, reducing setbacks, so how far structures can be away from each other and parcels next to each other or from the road, and a lot of other regulatory barriers to creating housing, specifically in dense places like the village, which is, for all intents and purposes, where we're focused on. The Planning Commission is again taking this up with the help of Two Rivers Ottaquechee Planning Commission, Regional Planning Commission, to look at the village zoning bylaws and remove further barriers and evaluate how our wishes for our community get reflected in our code. Definitely attend those meetings if you're curious to see how the sausage is made. I think our goal is to have those bylaws revised by the middle of summer. Something else we're doing is regulating short-term rentals. Folks know that the joint boards attempted to do this last year. We, again, want to have a unified ordinance, so I think it's something that the boards will take up again. We know short-term rentals have been a part of our community for a long time, but there has been a proliferation since the platforms like Airbnb and VRBO have come into existence. 10 years ago, maybe we had 15 to 25 short-term rentals in Woodstock. Last year, these platforms said we had somewhere between 100 and 125 available. We definitely want folks to be able to extract value from their homes, but I personally believe this is a privilege that should be enjoyed by primary homeowners. This also has public safety implications. We know during the floods last year that properties in the village that operated short-term rentals didn't have access to the water notifications we were getting for boil notices or do not drink notices. In the rural parts of town, there are people that get stuck on the roads because they're not prepared to visit and stay on rural places, and so those place a strain on our services. But again, short-term rentals, a lot of these things aren't going to solve housing the way that building is going to solve housing. That is going to be the single most important thing we do to alleviate the crisis. And so I think one of the most important things that we can do is make Woodstock attractive to developers. We're home to many small scale developers who really want to build. And so we're working with them to figure out how to get shovels in the ground in a way that fits into the character of the village, but also meets the needs of our economy. So I know the state is working while they're in session to make some adjustments to current housing regulations, and we'll wait to see what comes out of that. But I'm personally really excited and optimistic for Woodstock that we can take on these challenges and hopefully become a place that many people, teachers, nurses, mechanics, highway department folks can call home. Thanks for listening. If you have feedback or questions, you can reach me at lpowell@townofwoodstock.org or come to one of our many select board meetings.